Hello, debaters. The newest member of the policy debate argument family is the critique. The critique functions as an argument in response to the affirmative plan, an opposing argument, or the status quo. Although critiques are most often introduced by the 1NC, there are many affirmative critiques that may be introduced as part of the 1AC or even later in the debate as a response to negative arguments. The purpose of this video is to describe, define, and detail the purpose, structure, and types of critiques themselves. A critique is an analysis or a critique of the philosophical assumptions supporting the opposing team's arguments, the language used in a debate round, or the fairness of the activity itself. Critiques presume that some element of the debate round grows from a poisoned garden, and thus the ideas that grow from that garden are also poisoned, no matter how appealing they may look. So until the garden is fixed, it is necessary to reject its fruit. It is important to understand that critiques usually attack an underlying problem, not necessarily the surface level details. And this allows negative debate teams to focus less on the specific affirmative plan and more on the general system that supports the plan. For example, the affirmative team might advocate for a plan that encourages private businesses to invest in renewable energy. Negative teams might critique this plan by trying to prove that the plan further entrenches us in capitalism, which the negative claims is an abusive system that dehumanizes people for profit. Notice that this strategy allows the negative team to shift the focus of the debate round away from renewable energy and focus it squarely on capitalism. This shift away from the affirmative plan is one of the primary reasons that critiques have become so popular. A good negative team knows that the affirmative team is fully prepared to defend the fruits of their affirmative plan, but far less prepared to defend the garden from which it grows. Classifying critiques can be challenging, since critiques themselves often tackle issues much larger than the sandbox we call debate. But criticisms typically focus on three types of assumptions: rhetoric, policymaking, and identity. Let's start with the rhetoric critique. A rhetoric critique challenges the language used by the opposing team or the authors of the evidence. The words we use in our everyday lives tends to reflect our attitudes and beliefs. For example, the words stewardess, waitress, and hostess includes the diminutive S to signal that these jobs are supposedly meant for women, and job titles like chairman, congressman, and fisherman imply that such jobs are for men. Similarly, other words may signal racism, homophobia, structural violence, classism, ableism, anthropocentrism, and lots of other things. The presumption behind a rhetoric critique is that the language reflects who we are. And if who we are is discriminatory or exclusionary, then perhaps our ideas are as well. The same is true for rhetoric critiques that use language to focus on terror talk, nuclearism, or securitization. Such critiques could be triggered by a word in the evidence read by the opposing team, or even in the language used by the opposing teams themselves. A rhetoric critique claims that oppressive language reflects oppressive ideas, and that we should reject the opposing team's arguments because they are used by authors and perhaps even opponents whose choices of words should be questioned. In order to successfully win on a rhetoric critique, teams must be sincere and authentic in their understanding of the relationship between language and ethics. The policymaking critique focuses on the way our government or other organizations function and create policy. The general premise of the policymaking critique is that there's a fatal flaw in the system, and until we fix that flaw, any effort by the government to fix or improve the status quo will only make the flaw worse. Our three sample critiques are the capitalism critique, the security critique, and the terror talk critique. I'll discuss each one briefly to help you understand the general nature of policymaking critiques. The capitalism critique indicts capitalism as an evil system that only benefits a few winners and dehumanizes the many losers. Greed, resource hoarding, and treating workers and customers as commodities to be bought and sold are examples of the flaws of capitalism. The affirmative plan, which claims to improve the economy and/or the sale of goods and services, furthers this capitalist system and digs us deeper into the problem. By rejecting the affirmative plan, we can begin the process of rejecting capitalism. The security critique asserts that our government uses the concept of security as a false means of taking power away from we the people. Since 2001, the significant increase in government search and surveillance of our daily lives has slowly eroded our liberties. And as Americans, we have willingly allowed our basic liberties to be chiseled away in the name of security. The affirmative plan, which uses federal policymaking to keep us safe from harm, falsely uses the veil of security as propaganda for taking away our most treasured rights and justifying wars. The terror talk critique claims that our nation has become hypnotized by our fear of terrorism, and that our government uses the language of terrorism to justify extreme actions such as war, torture, drones, and the dehumanization of other cultures. The affirmative plan, which relies on terror talk to justify adoption of the affirmative plan, further entrenches us in the propaganda of terror talk and allows more atrocities to be committed in the names of our government. The final category of critiques is the identity critiques. These critiques are squarely focused on the question of whether debate as a high school activity is accessible and fair to all who want to participate. The underlying presumption is that debate is a socially normative activity, which means that without realizing it, we've sort of decided in our minds that debaters should look, act, speak, dress, and behave in a certain way. In other words, we have created a shared perception of what is normal and abnormal in the debate world. The problem is that there are many kids who want to participate in debate who don't look, act, speak, dress, and behave according to the unspoken hidden rules that the majority of debaters, coaches, and judges have silently and unknowingly established. For these students, the game of debate is rigged. Their choice is either to assimilate and become normal or stop participating in the game. In other words, these students have to check their identity at the door before they can be successful. Are non-white students as likely to succeed in debate? If not, why not? What about gay, lesbian, or bisexual students? What about transgender students or students living in poverty? Or disabled students, less attractive students, overweight students, students who speak with an accent? You get the idea. Students who don't look, act, speak, dress, or behave according to what is considered quote-unquote normal are less likely to succeed and therefore less likely to participate in the activity we call debate. Identity critiques are usually run by debate teams who are or who believe that they are excluded from the debate space. Their goal, apart from winning the debate round, is to demonstrate that they are excluded from the activity or that they are less likely to win for reasons unrelated to skill and talent. Some teams may even advocate for others in or out of the debate world who are excluded or marginalized. Now, it's important for both teams and the judge to keep in mind that the purpose of the identity critique is not always to attack the opposing team, but rather to expand the game we call debate to include all willing participants. In other words, eliminate the norm. Now, before we jump into the structure of a critique, let's look at one final concept that's essential for understanding the role of the critique in the debate round, and that's the role of the ballot. Before the emergence of critiques, a judge's ballot was a mechanism to determine either which reality the judge preferred, the world of the affirmative or the world in a negative, or the ballot was used as a mechanism to reward the debate team that did a better job of debating in the round. Now, in either case, the judge's decision occurred in a vacuum. It didn't actually change the world, influence federal policy, or decide anything other than a winning team and a losing team. In other words, the role of the ballot was to facilitate the competitiveness in a debate tournament. And in debate rounds without critiques, the role of the ballot remains the same. However, a critique sometimes claims to elevate the role of the ballot and asks the judge to use the ballot as a tool to reshape the activity or the status quo. In other words, the role of the ballot now has a sudden and outsized function beyond the round. For rhetoric critiques, the role of the ballot is to reshape the language we use in future debate rounds. For policymaking critiques, the role of the ballot might be to force future affirmative teams to create better affirmative plans that don't link to the critique. For identity critiques, the role of the ballot is to expand the debate space so that our definition of normal is to include everyone. In other words, judges in critique rounds are asked to use their ballots to do more than just pick winners and losers. Some teams believe that their ballots have their power to actually change what we do in and out of debate rounds. And if this is true, then the ballot really does take on an elevated role. Finally, let's look at the structure of a critique. Critiques are structured similar to disadvantages. They should be shelled out like a disadvantage and are typically read in the 1NC. However, keep in mind that critiques can often appear in the 1AC or even in later constructives if and when something happens that links to the critique. A critique contains 4 parts: the framework, the link, the impact, and the alternative. Each component requires evidence, and the evidence itself can and should be complex enough to fulfill the purpose of each component and make your case convincingly, but simple enough for the judge to absorb, process, and reflect upon in real time. The first part of the critique is usually the framework. The framework argument introduces the idea that there are things more important than the game we call debate. And just as the judge evaluates the round, he or she is just more than just a hypothetical policymaker who is considering the merits of the proposed affirmative plan. In fact, the judge is also an intellectual thinker who is not bound by the imaginary limits of what an elected official might do. In other words, there are no requirements that the judge preserve capitalism or propagate social normativity or defend the status quo. First and foremost, the judge should uphold the most important values or ethics presented in the round. The framework of your critique should pop that imaginary bubble that forces judges to function as traditional policymakers, and it should free them to use their ballot as a tool to correct the ills of society. More importantly, the framework argues that the critique should be elevated so that it gets decided first in the judge's decision. For example, if the affirmative team argues that their plan reduces terrorism, and the negative team critiques the plan and questions how we perceive terrorism, then the question of how we perceive terrorism should necessarily be resolved first, and only after we agree on how to perceive terrorism should we then consider the affirmative plan. So essentially, a critique is an impact calculation that weighs the impact of voting for or against a critique versus for or against other arguments. The second part is the link. Like a disadvantaged link, the critique link ties the opposing team's arguments or their language to the critique itself. Unlike the disadvantaged link, the critique link doesn't need to be necessarily unique. As an analogy, think about someone who tells a sexist joke. Even if there are hundreds of people telling sexist jokes at this very moment, we should never be okay with them. Similarly, there may be other hundreds of examples of capitalism or homophobia happening at this very moment, but the role of the ballot is to stamp out each and every instance. This is unlike a traditional disadvantage, where the affirmative plan must uniquely cause the impact to occur. Now, the evidence for a critique link should clearly connect what it is the opposing team does to trigger the critique to the claims and warrants in the link evidence. So, for example, if the opposing team uses the threat of terrorism to motivate our decision-making, the link evidence should clearly say that the threat of terrorism to justify policymaking is problematic and harmful because it leads to or causes X, Y, or Z. In the case of identity critiques, the link essentially functions a little differently. This is because identity critiques are so unlike other critiques. Rather than identifying something specific that the opposing team does, the critique is either triggered by previous experiences in or out of the debate round, or it is triggered simply by the traditional nature of the round in which everything appears to be normal, thus linking to an argument about social normativity. In other words, the mere fact that the round looks and feels like a traditional debate round could be reason enough to introduce an identity critique. And although the objection might seem abrupt or misplaced, that's largely the point. The next part of the critique argument is the impact, also called the implication. The purpose of this component is to explain how and why it isn't okay to allow the bad thing to continue happening. The evidence for the impact component of a critique should clearly describe what happens when we allow securitization or sexism or exclusion to continue. Like an impact and a disadvantage, the impact in a critique should paint a picture of what life looks like if we fail to stop the bad thing from happening. The fourth and final part of the critique argument is the alternative, where we describe what should happen instead of voting for the other team. In many instances, the alternative is to simply reject the plan, reject the status quo, or do nothing, which in turn stops the cycle from reoccurring. Oftentimes, the alternative to a critique is the most frustrating part for those who are not familiar with critiques or for those who are rooted in the policy-making part of policy debate. After all, it feels insufficient to reject terror talk in a debate round because it does so little to actually stop terrorism. For this reason, a good critique will do more than just reject the bad thing. Instead, a good critique should include a mechanism that gives the judge the option to do something as a policymaker that fixes the problem identified in the critique. Now that's it for critiques. Let's take a moment to review what we learned today. Critique, rhetoric critique, policymaking critique, identity critique, identity narrative, the role of the ballot, critique structure, framework, link, impact or implication, and the alternative. That's all for now. Good luck, debaters.